All right, welcome everyone. We have Coach Eric Cressy here to do a med ball training masterclass. And what's great about this is we had Eric at one of our Complete Speed and Power Summits do med ball training. It was awesome. It's one of those topics that I think you can go pretty in depth on, since we all use medicine balls for different power development. So this is kind of the perfect topic to dive deep into someone that's one of the best in the world at what he does. So please welcome Eric Cressy.
Thanks, Pat. And thank you everybody for jumping in on this. I know it's kind of challenging to start off the weekend with a block right here in the middle of the day for continuing education. So I appreciate you guys bearing with me. Pat was especially patient as we tried to schedule this. I got put in the MLB bubble for 22 days. So we had to kind of work around some of the logistics of being in different time zones. And so this wound up getting pushed back, but I appreciate his patience and all his work pulling this together. We're going to talk about something that's near and dear to me. And that's medicine ball training. For those of you who don't know, really training baseball players is our niche. It's a little over 80% of our clientele between our two different facilities, one in Florida and one in Massachusetts, as well as the work that I do in professional baseball. So it's certainly something that's right in our wheelhouse, and something that has evolved a ton over the years. Before we get going, just a couple of kind of quick bits of housekeeping. One, we're doing this over Zoom, so there's always going to be Wi-Fi challenges and background noise and things like that with a live recording. I'll do my best to keep the pro baseball players that are 10 feet to my left with music bumping in the background from jumping in and interrupting us. If you guys could stay muted, that would be super helpful as well. Normally, I really love to have a ton of audience interaction in the middle of presentations because full disclosure, I tend to get going really fast. So it tends to break up things and make it more conversational. And I think in this dynamic, unfortunately, we're going to have to kind of do questions at the end. So by all means, save everything you've got. I will make sure that we don't call it a day until every one of your questions is answered. And hopefully we get you pointed in the right direction with some good information that can really help your athletes. And with that said, we are going to rock and roll. So there we go. So the first thing is the who. When it comes to medicine ball training, you have to make sure that you're qualifying it. There's different ways to attack it. And really, different populations are going to necessitate a different approach. Sorry, this is being a little cranky, but rotational sport athletes, certainly there's a place to train that. I would say sagittal plane beasts. So what we tend to see a lot in our work with professional baseball players is we see a lot of athletes who lived in college weight rooms, right? So imagine the classic Division I weight room where there's 20 racks, there's dumbbells, there's barbells, but there's no cable columns, right? There's really not a whole lot of stuff in there that lends itself well necessarily to doing, plenty of rotational stuff and things along those lines, and developing power in non-traditional ways. They'd Olympic lift, they'd sprint, they'd jump, but a lot of times the rotational factors are overlooked. So when we get guys, at that point in their career, in many cases, just giving them a change of pace from what they're used to can be really, really impactful for them. Anyone looking for real world transfer from their training, we're going to talk a little bit more about why that's the case. Actually just featured Bill Parisi on a podcast I did, and Bill's gone really far down the fascia training rabbit hole, because I do think it's a big part of some of the athletic outcomes that either they're good or bad. And we just don't necessarily give it the consideration it needs in terms of chronic adaptations, because it maybe doesn't respond quite as quickly as muscle mass and strength and some of those classic measures. Your fascial system adapts a little bit differently, and profound changes can take 18 to 24 months. So we have to be cognizant of not just how our training impacts the current session, but how it impacts the chronic adaptations. We'll also use med ball medleys for folks who are looking for fat loss, right? Not a lot of ground reaction forces and throwing med balls. So it can be great if you have a overweight client who moves pretty well, but isn't a candidate to go out and sprint, change directions, run miles, whatever it may be. So definitely a good little change of pace where you can get some conditioning in, but you can also expose folks to different planes of motion. Anyone looking for a different way to train the core in a more integrated way. And I think traditionally we've recognized that just doing a bunch of sit-ups and crunches and things like that aren't necessarily an ideal way to train, but we progressed doing chops to doing lifts, a lot of the anti-rotation, anti-extension stuff, which I think is great. The thing that's a little bit challenging with some of that stuff is it still tends to be slow speed. So I think there's something to be said about training force transfer, working through hip rotation and thoracic spine rotation through a stable core at higher velocities, because ultimately that's what we encounter in the real world, whether we're talking about actually training athletes who are competing in crazy high velocities, or we're talking about training everyday people who want to avoid falling when they slip on the ice or something like that. So we've got to prepare people for what life throws at them. Additionally, anyone looking to improve hip, ankle, thoracic spine mobility, and scapular, glenohumeral, and core stability, both because of the way that we teach some of these exercises, the way that we teach force transfer, but also, we do a lot of fillers between sets, right? So you might do a set of 6 on each side, and then you've got, a minute and a half to rest during that time. We work on one of these, kind of components of overall fitness, and tends to make better use of our time. Anyone looking to iron out imbalances, if you guys are familiar with the Posture Restoration Institute, certainly there's a level of asymmetry that's normal to the human body, and then there's excessive asymmetry that we often encounter, where we see really low right shoulders, really adducted right hips. Right-handed athletes who play a right-hand dominant sport, living in a right-handed world, those are challenges that we have to overcome. So there may be times when, we're doing a lot more left-only rotational shot put, stuff along those lines. And then anyone who derives pleasure from trying to break stuff. I'd be lying if I didn't say that throwing med balls is fun. We'll often use cues of, I'll give you $20 if you break the med ball in this set. Very, very big outcome measures, but things that, allow people to go out and get after it. And so we've definitely gone through a lot of med balls over the years. I've given a lot of my money to perform better to replace med balls, and I have no problem doing it because I know what it's delivering for our athletes. So where did this need for med ball come about? To be honest, we really started with this in 2006, 2007, and probably 8 and 9 was when our pro baseball crowd really took off. And I realized how impactful this was for them. I mean, there were several reasons why. I think the first thing is specificity is awesome until it isn't. And I'm going to talk about this with some of the subsequent slides, some of the things that we deal with in the baseball world that, certainly make this an important initiative. But I think you're also going to see commonalities with, what we do with tennis players, what hockey players need, what some of those other rotational sport athletes encounter. It's a way to train important qualities without beating them up more than their sport already does. Additionally, conventional strength and conditioning approaches can often create negative adaptations in terms of the fascial system and the movement variability. So this is something I've dug in much, much deeper on. And in full transparency, I look back on some of the outcomes, the favorable outcomes we got in 2007 to 2012. And a lot of times we were successful by accident. We wrote a program that just happened to match up with the athlete in front of us, but we also probably missed out on some things that could have really helped some of our athletes. So, Bill Hartman's done some great stuff lately with, wide versus narrow infrasternal angles, and some of just the clues they can give you into how you should train an athlete. And certainly as we've looked at that more, it's allowed us to make our exercise selection a little bit more pinpointed. And I think a lot of the favorable outcomes that we're seeing are some of the chronic adaptations with respect to the fascial system, as much as it is just the transient improvements in range of motion that we get from, doing a kettlebell arm bar or doing some of those things. And then last but not least, something you probably all heard me talk about quite a bit. There's a sweet spot on the speed strength continuum that's hard to train. So this obviously, kind of works in parallel to the force velocity curve, and we'll talk about kind of why that's the case. But med balls certainly fit in on this for rotational sport athletes, but you could make the argument it fits in for every athlete. So when we talk about this concept of specificity, when we're dealing with athletes, you really have to look at this bell curve of progress and variability, right? When you have very little variability, you're not going to achieve a lot of progress. Why? You do a couple of things, right? You come in, you squat, you bench, you deadlift. Powerlifters don't make great tennis players. They don't do awesome with change of direction. You don't give them a broad enough, you don't give them that rich proprioceptive environment they really need to prepare themselves for not only the unpredictability in athletics and in everyday life, but you also increase the potential for overuse injuries. So I think there's a certain amount of variability that we need to apply to all of our training programs in order to ensure optimal progress. And obviously progress is a very, very broad term that could be with respect to mobility, strength, power, a million different qualities. But by that same token, if variability goes too high, progress falls off, right? If you don't have a little bit of familiarity in your program, it's hard to really get enough good quality reps in to really create adaptation. So the example I would give for a young athlete was, let's say I had an athlete who was just starting up with me, and I gave him a kettlebell sumo deadlift on Monday, a trap bar deadlift on Wednesday, and a conventional deadlift on Friday. And I did that for the whole month. At the end of the month, I'm probably going to see much better gains from that athlete who came in and trap bar deadlifted Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and just enough consistency to get some groove. And then what we can do is later on we develop a little bit more variability, and then you all of a sudden see, West Side lifters that are rotating their max effort exercise every week because they built enough movement competency, enough of a foundation to be able to take on that kind of variability in a shorter training block. And what we're really looking for is this, right? And this is a great graphic from the virtual world, but really you'll find it all over coaching. And what we realize is with a lot of our athletes, when they first walk in, they're unconsciously incompetent, right? They don't know that their lunge looks terrible, right? They think their push-up looks perfect, even though their hips are sagging, they're in a huge forward head posture, their elbows are flared out, whatever it may be. So they're unconsciously incompetent. And what we do with coaching is we make them aware of, hey, you're in forward head posture. Let's focus on getting your chest to the floor before your nose does. We give them some kind of cue that makes them aware of the fundamental movement flaw that we see. And what we do is we make it a good rep. And in doing that good rep, you've created conscious competence, right? You've made the athlete aware of how to move, and you've executed perfect training. And what we're looking for is this green box, this conscious competence. This is 75, 80% of what we do in our coaching of athletes, because the goal is to get so many reps in from a conscious competence standpoint that eventually they become unconsciously competent, right? They get so good at doing that change of direction, shin angle drill that they learned from Lee Taft, that eventually they got to change direction on the tennis court. Everything feels perfectly fluid. They don't even have to think about it. And you go back and you watch the video and you're like, wow, it actually worked. That's what good coaching is. So I think the challenge though is when you have high variability in your training programs early on, unfortunately, you never get enough conscious competence reps. And we need to make sure that those things happen. You spend a whole lot of time in this bottom left corner, conscious incompetence, trying to find the right path rather than taking the right paths and just ingraining it. And one of the places that we see this in the baseball world is actually some of the adaptations that take place when you don't have excessive variability, when you have consistency of throwing. So what I want you to imagine is, Pat's out back playing catch with his sons in the backyard right now. I know they're young guys and super athletic and all about the Boston Red Sox. So those guys are out playing catch in the backyard. And what actually happens is that they lay their arm back into this laid back position. They're actually creating a torquing effect at their proximal humeral growth plate. So what's actually happening is that bone is just warping a little bit to allow for more layback. It's not true external rotation because it actually happens a little bit further down on the humerus, as opposed to really getting true rotation at the shoulder. But what you see is on the left, a baseball player, and on the right, a British guy who actually mostly played golf growing up, right? So, and this is where some of like the discussions of, for lack of a better term, throwing like a girl came from, right? One of the reasons why people throw like a girl is because they have to lead with the elbow. And it's because a lot of females aren't exposed to sports that preserve humeral retroversion at a young age. So, whereas on the guy on the left, he lays it back really, really free and easy. This guy just doesn't have the layback. He might have decent shoulder external rotation, but he doesn't have the adaptation at that growth plate. So don't say throw like a girl, say throw like a British golfer who never played baseball. We'll jump forward a little bit. And what's really interesting is you can actually look at these baseball players and you can see this adaptation. This was a 17-year-old athlete that we saw. He's now playing Division I baseball as a two-way player. He's a right-handed individual. Look at the bone density in his right humerus. Okay, there's substantially more, cross-sectional area. The bone mineral content is higher. The bone mineral density is higher. That's adaptation to impose demand. We need to get humeral retroversion in that shoulder, and we also need to have enough bone density so he doesn't wind up with growth plate fractures by the time he's 20 when he's throwing the ball 95. And what we realize is this can be really applied over your entire body. We just talked about specific adaptations that take place up at the shoulder, but in reality, this is a great study that looks at adolescent baseball pitching. And what they have is your pelvis and your thorax positioning. This is your left ASIS and your right ASIS. So what you can see here is that you have a hip that's effectively starting to rotate towards the plate as that front foot gets down in the pitching delivery. And concurrently, the right and left shoulder joint centers of rotation are still going in the opposite direction. This is that hip shoulder separation that you hear about in baseball, whether it's hitting or pitching. It's what you hear about hockey with the slap shot. It's what you hear about golf. And there's different levels of this, right? In golf, we have crazy hip shoulder separation because the player dictates the pace of the game. He can get as big as he wants with this swing. In pitching, it's a little bit less because in many cases you're holding runners, right? And with hitters, there's much less hip shoulder separation because you're trying to respond to a ball that's thrown at you. And then we look at, this isn't nearly as prevalent because this is the kinetic chain, right? We create this elastic energy where, in this case, for a right-handed individual, the hips are working counterclockwise while the torso is still working clockwise. That stretch from the lower half eventually gets up where they're working in concert. Those forces are higher up at max external rotation. So I've shifted it up and now I've pre-stretched my lat, one of those powerful internal rotators of the shoulder. I'm getting my pec major, my subscapularis a little bit more involved. And then it's going up to the elbow and in turn to the hand to impart force to the baseball. So this graphic really shows this kinetic chain concept working up from the ground to the baseball. And it gets even more efficient and more profound as we talk about, elite throwers and obviously doing biomechanical analysis is big business. But one of the things that becomes very, very challenging when we deal with baseball players is this middle of the road, this maximal external rotation, this ball release, right? We have crazy distraction forces on the shoulder at ball release. I've heard it's anywhere from 1.5 to 2 times body weight and ground reaction forces. So, you're a candidate for effectively a shoulder subluxation. It's going to beat up on your biceps tendon. It's going to beat up on the underside of your elbow. You're going to aggressively crank into IR. And also at max external rotation, which we'll see in a slide here in a second, there's tons of stress on the biceps tendon, the labrum, the undersurface of the rotator cuff, lots of stress on the medial elbow, both the ulnar collateral ligament, the flexor tendon, the pronators, the ulnar nerve, all these different things. And what you want is the ability to train this hip shoulder separation without all the danger that comes from high velocity throwing that you want to try to get a break from at certain points during the year. So when we look at pitching, this is that laid back position. This is tons of stress on both the shoulders. You have medial tensile forces, lateral compressive forces at the elbow. You have the peel back mechanism working at the shoulder. Obviously, there's a ton of stress lower down, with respect to bracing in that front foot as well. You're also dealing with a ton of aggressive elbow extension towards ball release. The 7,000 degrees per second of internal rotation recorded during the pitching motion is the fastest motion ever recorded in sports. So you can't just do it 12 months out of the year, without hesitation. You've got to be careful and judicious about how you apply it. We also know that hitting is equally stressful, at least in terms of the lower half. You'll see oblique strains, things along those lines, even if it doesn't beat the shoulders and elbows up quite as much. But we see pretty crazy rotational velocity at the hip. We see a longer stride up to 380% of hip width. Hip and lumbar stability can be closely related. So, right, if you want to sell out for big hip mobility like that, you better have a stable core through which you can work through. So this is one of our free agent pro guys who was just hitting outside the facility this morning, and I snapped. You realize that 380%. It doesn't seem like a lot when you're looking at it, but in terms of the number, you do need a lot of motion in all 3 planes of motion of your hip. You need hip extension, abduction, and ERI are lots of important factors. If we look back to this study from way back in 1993, they looked at 18 professional baseball hitters, and what was interesting is they found no significant difference in activity between the lead and the trail erector spinae during a phase. So there were also no difference between the lead and trail obliques. The gist here is that if we create power through the ground, work through our hips, and we transfer force effectively through our core to allow for good thoracic spine mobility to really take place, that's how we transfer energy to the bat or to the ball. So this med ball concept is super valuable for being able to train this at times of year when you might otherwise not be able to do it in a sports specific context. Now, at the other end of the spectrum, you have problems with low variability, right? So if we look at the baseball, the Japanese baseball community is notorious for this. You see some absolutely terrible adaptations in young pitchers because they get so overused. And in Japan, they have this national high school tournament where we every year hear about insane pitch counts, but we'll also see it in the professional ranks. This guy threw a 514 pitch bullpen and then 267 pitches the next day. Probably the most unhappy guy on the planet is his bullpen catcher who had to sit there for 6 hours. That's a ton of pitches, and it's an excessive amount of volume with very little variability. And the reason is very simple. You want every one of those pitches to look the same. If you throw a 2-seam, a 4-seam, a changeup, a curveball, and a slider and a cutter, you want them all to come out of the exact same tunnel so they look the same to the hitter. Variability makes you a less successful pitcher. What we know is when you do this at a young age, you get unfavorable adaptations. So we talked about the bone density of the humerus. We talked about the retroversion. What was really interesting in this 2016 study, they looked at Japanese boys and girls between ages 9 and 12. They excluded players who were actively out of baseball because they were symptomatic. So they took all the hurt kids out, only tested the healthy kids. And what was interesting was that they found that 42% of them had some kind of UCL damage on MRI, and it was 63% pitchers. This is about 20% higher than a comparable American study. So it is significantly worse over there. What was the craziest part of this was, 12 hours, 48 minutes a week of average training, but the standard deviation was 5 hours, 18 minutes. So you had, parents / coaches that were running 9-year-olds out for over 20 hours a week of baseball training. That just doesn't end well. It's not a great place to be if you're doing it every single day with that insane amount of volume, because there's only so much that you can do on a baseball field that doesn't involve throwing. So we do see lack of variability becoming a big problem in these communities. Interestingly, we have, other populations. Mark Philippon's a hip surgeon out in Colorado who's extremely well known and has done some of the biggest names among celebrities and athletes alike in terms of hip surgeries. And he actually did a study that compared hockey players and skiers. They looked at them at age 10 to 12, 13 to 15, and 16 to 19-year-old age groups. And what they found was that the incidence of femoral acetabular impingement, bony overgrowth in the hip, and labral tears in hockey players, it climbed with each successive year. And what's interesting is that dramatic change wasn't prevalent in skiers. So there's something that's happening in the world of hockey, whether that's the aggressive rotation, whether it's violent extension rotation with a slap shot, whether it's skating in an externally rotated position where you're slunched over. Like there's all these different things that could be contributing to it. But we do know we're seeing adaptive changes in young kids. Larson also showed it in 2013. 87% of high-level college football hips had FAI, but only 31% had symptoms. We probably don't see the same kind of unfavorable adaptation if kids are taking time off and getting a little bit more variability. Maybe it's more working their dry land training as opposed to just skating all the time. Maybe it's a matter of, getting these kids to play another sport when they're not playing hockey. Whatever it may be, we do know that in young age groups, lacking variability is significantly problematic. And what we see, though, is you test the limits of hip range of motion. This is one of our retired pro guys who's a big dude, pretty hypermobile. So you see pretty extreme hip abduction range of motion. You see him bracing into a front foot, but this is that point where the pelvis has started to rotate counterclockwise while his torso is still rotating clockwise. Another one, a little bit more stiffer athlete. This guy's in the big leagues right now, but again, his separation is a little bit less extreme, not as much hip abduction. So there is like kind of a unique signature style to this where the previous athlete was a big stride. This guy's a shorter stride. You're able to train some of the stuff that, is specific to the way that you go about your rotational business. And one of the things that we really look at from an adaptation to imposed demand is this component of thoracic rotation, which is super important for allowing that hip shoulder separation to really occur. And if you take a look at this athlete on the left, this is a professional baseball player who's a little bit more hypermobile. And for him, he's got a very flat thoracic spine. He's what we would call a narrow infrasternal angle. He rotates extremely well. He's up at 80 to 85 degrees on a lumbar locked rotation test. If you look at Greg Rose from the Titleist Performance Institute, Greg will talk about 50 to 70 degrees in general population, 70 to 90 in rotational sport athletes. Here's another athlete, actually a aspiring pro golfer who's upwards of 90, incredible thoracic mobility. And if I took both of these guys passively a little bit further than get to active, they've got even more motion they aren't tapping into. Conversely, this is one of our workers who is a competitive powerlifter who's squatted over 6 and deadlifted over 7, and you realize that that's adaptation to imposed demand, right? He doesn't need a whole lot of thoracic rotation to be an accomplished power lifter. So he's not going to look really, really good rotationally, but he has laid down some adaptation that'll help from a compressive loading standpoint. And we need to be cognizant of how we train these people. If we go out and we give this guy on the right a lot of aggressive rotation, we're probably going to wind up with some spine problems, similar to how we see a lot of stress fractures in offensive linemen in the NFL, where there's an element of extension or rotation on a spine that's probably more conditioned for compression. And then these athletes on the left, they have these spines that are very bendy, and they tend to work really well with rotational stress and things like that. If we just give them a ton of compressive loading, they're probably not going to handle it great. And Dr. McGill has has put forth some pretty good ideas that talks about disc size and shape, and how that may be a little bit of an element of natural selection that makes us better as rotational sport athletes versus, contact sport athletes. And if we look at this guy on the right with a very wide infrasternal angle, kind of like what we expect to see in our power lifters, our NFL linebackers, et cetera, there's always going to be a lot of hypertonicity in a lot of these muscles, lat, quadratus lumborum, some of the lumbar erectors, that tend to bring us up in the front and, kind of keep us compressed in the back. So a lot of times these athletes just aren't necessarily conditioned well for rotation, because you think about the chronic adaptations that happen with some of these muscles that are needed to allow them to rotate. So it's not uncommon to see these being soft tissue limitations in athletes, and you free them up, you give them some positional breathing, you do some manual therapy, and all of a sudden they're in a much better position to actually go out and rotate. So I'm gonna give you some recommended reading before I get to the meat and potatoes. Make sure you go out and check this study out. It's in Sports Medicine several years ago. Basically, it was developing maximal neuromuscular power, training considerations for improving maximal power production. Outstanding research. Dr. Robert Newton has been around. I think he was at Ball State back in the day, and now he's out in Australia. But his work on power has been phenomenal. He did some studies many years ago about how strength training, having a foundation of maximal strength, is an important foundation for developing power. You looked at college volleyball players where power improvements didn't come if you didn't have a strength foundation. So he's done some great work, and this is part of his group. But there are really 4 key principles for power development that we have to keep in mind. The first is that a fundamental relationship exists between strength and power, which dictates that an individual cannot possess a high level of power without first being relatively strong, right? You can't apply force quickly if you can't apply sufficient force. So a lot of these med ball principles, they're fun and you can use them for your 12-year-old athletes. But at the end of the day, they're going to mean a lot more to that 16-year-old athlete that you've trained, and he's got a 315 trap bar deadlift and understands how to put some force in the ground. He can do a reverse lunge with a front squat grip with 135 pounds or whatever it may be. And don't just think you have to be a squat bench clean, kind of like traditional measure of strength. Sometimes strength can be single leg. Sometimes strength can be, loaded push-ups, something along those lines. But just be cognizant of you need to develop force first. The second thing is consideration of movement pattern, load, and velocity specificity is essential when designing power training programs. In other words, don't think that you're just going to be able to jump and it's going to magically carry over to rotational power. And I'm going to talk about all 4 of these factors in the grand scheme of things, because it's kind of interesting how I think I discovered this by accident over the years. It's vital to consider the individual athlete's window of adaptation for each neuromuscular factor contributing to maximal power production when developing an effective and efficient power training program. A training program that focuses on the least developed factor contributing to maximal power will prompt the greatest neuromuscular adaptations and therefore result in superior performance improvements for that individual. In other words, figure out what quality is the lowest hanging fruit, train the heck out of it. Don't just put one dry erase program up there for all your athletes, because chances are there are going to be some that are very poorly equipped to succeed with it. And then fourth, a key consideration for the long-term development of an athlete's maximal power production capacity is the need for an integration of numerous power training techniques. This integration allows for variation within the power meso/microcycles while still maintaining specificity, which is theorized to lead the greatest long-term improvement in maximal power. So in other words, don't detrain one quality as you sell out for another. Make sure that you're actually able to integrate multiple qualities in a fixed kind of training cycle. So here's something that's really interesting. Point number 1, I talked about in my first book back in 2006. I wrote the Ultimate Off-Season Training Program. I used the analogy of a glass, where the size of the glass is your maximal strength. The fluid in the glass is all those other qualities: power, endurance, joint stability. If you don't have a large enough glass, putting everything else in there won't matter. Okay, it'll just overflow. The same thing holds true. The second one, consideration of movement pattern, load, and specificity is essential, right? In 2011, January of 2011, I wrote an article called What I Learned in 2010 for T Nation. And in that I said, I think that power is plane specific. I've seen too many baseball players run in here or come in here with a 20-inch vertical jump and then go through 95 miles an hour. It makes no sense to me. Likewise, I've seen guys that can jump out of the gym who are so poorly equipped to create rotational power that just doesn't make sense to me. And I just put out there, I think power is plane specific, and I'm not sure that a lot of jump training and Olympic lifts is going to carry over to throwing a baseball or hitting a baseball. Right after the article was published, I got an email from a guy named Graham Lehman, who actually wound up publishing his master's thesis study in the Journal of Strength and Conditioning Research in 2012. And they were looking at exactly that. They found that sprinting speed and broad jump had very little to no predictive value for actually looking at throwing velocity. The only things that carried over was a single leg lateral hop for distance and a rotational med ball throw for distance. Those predicted it much more. Now, don't take that to mean we don't need to train those other qualities, right? Because our hitters and our pitchers, they still need to run, they still need to jump, they still need to change direction. But if we're talking about actual carryover, it's got to be rotational / frontal plane. Additionally, you got to consider the individual athlete's window of adaptation for each neuromuscular factor, right? In other words, we've got to look at this static spring continuum, this absolute speed to absolute strength continuum, which is something I put up on YouTube back in like 2012. It's just something that demonstrates that, we'll talk about it in a second here, is that if you're strong, you got to train fast. If you're fast, you got to train strong. We know it's easier to make a fast guy strong than it is to make a strong guy fast. You'd always pick the naturally really active athlete. But again, this is stuff that's been out there. A key consideration for long-term development of an athlete's maximal power production capacity is the need for an integration of numerous power training techniques, right? Every program I've ever written has been concurrent training approach. In other words, we train multiple qualities in the same mesocycle, in the same session, because I think it's that important to preserve one quality in the way that it feeds into the next. So looking back on it, this is an example of why sometimes we got results, even though we didn't realize why we were doing it. We created a foundation of strength. We trained power in a plane specific context. We listened to athletes and individualized for their specific power needs. And then last but not least, we never let specific qualities detrain. All right, so let's talk about how you build athletes, right? So if you look at this elite sprinter, right? Take an example of an Olympic caliber sprinter. You're going to see them doing absolute speed stuff. They're going to run fast. They're going to jump high. They're going to do skips, marches. They're going to do plyos, you name it. At the other end of the spectrum, they're going to lift heavy. They're going to squat. They're going to deadlift. And then there's also kind of this middle of the road, this speed strength, which might be like a jump squat at 30% of 1 rep max on a squat. And then there's street strength speed, more of like an Olympic lift. Maybe those guys go out and they take a 50-pound med ball and do some clean tosses. So it's kind of somewhere between that speed strength and strength speed. The point is that they're training all along these continuums. I was at the University of Connecticut in 2003 to 2005, and really my primary teams that I worked with while I was there were basketball and soccer, and basketball was the one that was the most intriguing because we would have athletes that rolled in at age 18 and they had just played hours and hours of basketball for years and really never touched the weight room. So they were all the way over to this absolute speed end of the continuum. So what we would do, we would get them strong, and you'd see these guys jump out of the gym, just being able to put more force to the ground with the given reactive ability they had. We brought them all the way to the right of this continuum. And then by the time sophomore, junior year rolls around, we could do a lot more stuff in the middle, right? Where you could actually challenge them a little bit more in those speed strength and strength speed initiatives. So just something to be said about setting the stage for long-term success by actually appreciating where athletes are. And we're developing more and more tools for being able to identify that, right? We've got more force plates, at facilities. We've got more convenient vertical jump testing stuff. We use something called the Proteus at our facility to check for various components of rotational power and transitional power and elasticity. There's so many different things you can test now. Now, how do we apply that to pitching? Well, absolute speed would be throwing a 5-ounce baseball, right? Whether it's long toss, bullpens, flat ground drills. And absolute strength is going to be what we do in strength training. Speed strength is going to be throwing weighted balls. They're a little bit heavier than the 5-ounce baseball. And then when we get to strength speed, that's where our med ball comes in. We can do medicine ball training. We can use the Proteus. We can use the versatility. Proteus being more concentric dominant, versatility being more eccentric dominant. But we can train at all these different points along this curve and can create some really powerful adaptations, not just in terms of, actually, training in the planes that matter, but I think also in terms of getting some favorable adaptations, through the fascial system that keep these athletes healthy longer term. And the research certainly supports it. There's a correlation of throwing velocity to the results of lower body field tests. This is the Graham Lehman study. This study found that lateral to medial jumps were consistently correlated with high throwing velocity in each of the throwing techniques. This is the first study to correlate throwing velocity with the unilateral jump in the frontal plane, mimicking the action of the throwing stroke. So we test a height and for distance, with our athletes, and our pro guys consistently outperform our college and our high school guys. It's just the nature of how it works. But building on that with some chronic studies, they actually did some interesting stuff that looked at lumbopelvic control. So we don't just use our med ball stuff to train power. We actually use it a lot to train balance, some of the anti-rotation capabilities. 75 pro pitchers tested on a standing, basically balance test, and they looked to see, do these predict outcomes? And they found that basically players with worse standing lumbopelvic control were more likely to have poor whip, walks and hits per inning pitched, and fewer innings pitched than people who actually scored well in this. So in other words, you're more likely to pitch more innings if you do well with your balance, right? And that's the most important stat in baseball is innings pitched, regardless of what anyone tells you. If you're a good pitcher, you throw a lot of innings and you're available for your team. So we certainly have some indirect research that shows that this probably helps an athlete with their command and their ability to locate pitches. Szymanski at Louisiana Tech has done a lot of really good research in baseball players, and they looked at effective torso rotational strength on hip, angular, shoulder, and linear bat velocities. They basically took two studies. One was a lifting and a hitting group. One lifted, hit, and did a 3 times a week med ball program, and they showed a dramatic difference. Granted, these were untrained subjects, but at the end of the day, that was the only change in the program. You expected everybody to get better, and they did. They saw a 7% improvement in dominant and a 7% increase in dominant and an 8% increase in non-dominant torso rotational strength. And the med ball throw was 7% better in the group that did everything. So just goes to show you, adding a med ball, kind of program to what you're doing. We typically do 3 days a week with aggressive rotation and overhead stuff. It will have benefits for you. Additionally, I think this is a really important test that has nothing to do with rotational power on the outset, but I think it's an important one for anyone to know. This was actually done in conjunction with Exos up in Panhandle of Florida. And what they actually did was they looked at firefighters, and they put them into 3 groups. Okay, so first they did is they pre-tested them on a bunch of non-training tests. They looked at like firefighter specific challenges. And then what they did was they followed things up after measuring how they performed on those. They gave them 12 weeks of training. One group did a movement guided fitness. They got coaching on how to move correctly. Another group basically got a program, said, go do your thing. And then a third group, the control group, basically got absolutely nothing. They didn't train. So they looked at them before and after these 12 weeks of training, and they found that both the training groups improved their fitness, VO2 max, body composition. But what was interesting is when they actually looked at the joint forces in the group as they repeated those firefighter specific tasks, they found that only the movement quality group improved in terms of reducing stress and sharing it across multiple joints. So the gist of this is that coaching matters, right? Don't just hand somebody a program and tell them to do it. How you do things actually has an important role in creating long-term adaptations. And what does this mean in the context that we're talking about? If we throw the crap out of the med ball rotationally, it's going to carry over to pitching. It's going to carry over to hitting. It's going to make it easier to change direction, to decelerate. All those things, will have a downstream effect as long as they're coached correctly. So how do we sequence our med ball stuff? Well, with our general fitness clients, we'll generally do it early in the training session. Why? Because in many cases, our general fitness clients aren't great movers, right? They might not do well with getting rotation in the right places when they're fatigued. So throwing it on the end of a training session probably isn't an ideal scenario. Maybe at the end of a training session, you're better off with lower velocity core training. That might mean stability ball rollout or a half kneeling chops, something along those lines. Conversely, at the end of the session, you could use it as fat loss, right? So if you have a client who's a good mover and you want to give them a 60 throw med ball circuit that integrates 6 different variations of 10 throws each, that could be a great initiative. Okay? Conversely, rotational sport athletes, totally different, right? So we have kind of the early off season, the mid off season, the late off season, and then the actual in season phases. Those are going to be what we're dealing with. There'll obviously be like a little bit of like a downtime at the end of the season before we even get to it. But in that first month of the offseason, we're assuming we're dealing with a minor league player. Traditionally, their season will wrap up that first week in September. They usually take a week or 2 off, and maybe we get them September 15th. So September 15th, up until late October, early November, we're going to be careful about doing a lot of aggressive elbow extension work. We'll do more single leg balance stuff. We'll do more anti-rotation work where we're teaching them how to work through a mobile thoracic spine with a stiffer lower half, like so they're working over their front hip. I wouldn't even necessarily call it true power training in that first month. It's probably 4 days a week. It's a lot of balance stuff, anti-rotation catches, and we'll show a bunch of these in a second here. But as we get past that and guys are feeling better, we want to get a good block of training in where, hey, they're about to start ramping up throwing, hitting. We want to make sure we prepare them for it. We're going to train them a little bit more on the force end of the force velocity continuum. So we'll hit scoop toss, shot puts, overhead stomps, all those. Not as much one arm work, and then 140 to 230, 200 total throws per week. So if we did 3 sets of 6 per side on a rotational scoop toss, that would be 36 reps, 18 on each side. Spread over 3 sessions. And it's generally speaking 1 rotational, 1 overhead variation per session. Sometimes we'll change this. There may be scenarios where I push it way, way harder at a guy who's really strong, but not quite as powerful, particularly this year more so than ever, just because I feel like we do have a fair amount of athletes that have been with us for an extended period of time. And they had a shorter season this year, so they're coming back stronger than they otherwise would have. And typically this will coincide with the onset of a throwing program or hitting for most athletes. We have some athletes that never really shut down. They just keep playing catch, but a lot of them will shut down and start ramping up around Thanksgiving time. Late off season, this is when we start getting much more, more throwing, more aggressive hitting, where guys are hitting 5 or 6 days a week. Guys are throwing 4 to 5 days a week. So we'll often abbreviate the sessions a little bit. We might do fewer total throws. We might move more complex exercises as a way to keep the volume down. But the idea is just, as throwing volume goes up, as hitting volume goes up, we're going to bring our volume of medicine ball stuff in the gym down. And then once you get in season, we don't do a ton of volume. I use it with college guys on 7-day rotations. I will use it with some of our big league guys and minor league guys on 5-day rotations as well. We might do opposite side only. What I'll often do with guys is I may throw 1 overhead and 1 rotational variation at the end of a warm up. So, every day they're just going to get like a little bit of like a neural charge. And some guys really, really like that. And it's a way to just kind of preserve some of the patterns that we get. But we'll also train the single leg balance stuff pretty hard throughout those times. So let's kind of talk about how we classify some of these. So anti-rotation shot put, stiff front leg, working through good thoracic rotation. I apologize if some of these videos are choppy. The other thing, I'm going to give a big shout out to Andrew Lacey and Ryan Williams, 2 of our coaches down here. These guys filmed a ton of videos the other night for us, and we're very helpful. So just remember, filming 60 different rotational and overhead med ball videos at once is challenging. So some of them might not be at 100%. But again, we're working through the upper back, trying to get that scapula to rotate around the rib cage as he works over a stiffer front leg and doesn't allow it to drift. Then we'll get him more upright, split stance, anti-rotation, scoop toss, working again over that front leg. Again, moving through that upper back, just finding motion where we can. This is a 6-pound ball. We'll go anywhere from 6 to 10 on this, whereas it was 4 pounds on the half kneeling variation for the shot put. And here's just an anti-rotation drill, right? Just a single leg balance drill. You can work a little bit further away from the wall. We may go down and do this in like a 1-leg RDL position as a way to kind of progress that balance challenge. Building on it, anti-rotation, receive and release. It's partner assisted, so he's resisting the destabilizing torque that's getting to him. After you've done this for a while, I'll make it unpredictable. I'll throw high, low. I'll throw it right at the athlete. I'll joke around and throw change-ups, cutters, curveballs, whatever it is, just to give them an element of unpredictability with this. And you can do it either leg supporting. So this is an inside leg support, and outside leg support would just be his left leg down from this angle. And you'll realize even guys that teach this all day, there's some moving parts to it. They gotta work through it. Side to side scoop toss. I like this as an early, like learning to load the hip and just be rhythmic with this stuff. So once they've gotten the hang of working through some of this stuff, we'll actually make this a lot more rhythmic where they'll go run right after the other. And again, you'll notice we're always trying to find our hips. So one of the things I'll often use as a coaching cue for this is I'll actually go up and I'll put my hand, assuming it's a male athlete, 6 or 8 inches behind their hip, and I'll actually have him try to get back, find my hand. You can do it with a dowel rod or something like that. But just one of those things where we're trying to get some posterior excursion of the hip in order to kind of teach some of those hinging patterns that we want to see later on. Again, single leg balance, free training. We hit it hard in this first month. Anti-rotation stuff side to side. We talk a lot about tripod foot in this position, 3 points of contact. And then we actually will get to some of our rotational stuff. So rotational shot put, trying to be a little bit more rhythmic. Some athletes will segment it one by one. I like the idea of going one right after the next as we work through some of this stuff. The other thing we're looking at is shin angles. So let's see if I can stop him at the point where he goes into his first rep. So when you're at his load, what we want to see is that knee inside the foot. This is something the folks at On-Base you talk about a lot about, is when your knee gets outside your foot, that's what we would consider sway. And you will see different positions of hip abduction. Some of the best hitters in the game are in kind of like a hip in front of the knee positive move. Whereas I actually will see some athletes, Aaron Judge is a really good example of a guy whose hip is outside his knee to give him adjustability in that back hip. So there's no one way to do that, but the thing you should always coach is the knee relative to the ankle, but not necessarily the hip relative to the knee. I think a lot of times we coach athletes to stay in that hip too long, and we'll talk about some coaching cues for those individuals as we get a little bit further down. So that was shot put. Rotational scoop toss, a little bit of a better option if you have athletes that have come off of some kind of elbow pathology. Tends to work better if you got someone who has problems with distraction, stresses on the shoulder. So with this one, again, it's all about delivering that force into that front hip. We'll talk about it a little bit later on, but watch that front leg. That's where the power comes from. We talk about riding the bike into the curb. We'll talk about front hip pullback. The idea is that needs to brace and effectively take a triplanar motion and turn it into something much more linear. Just like a front leg allows you to throw a baseball straight downhill, this is something that allows you to take the frontal and the transverse plane and shift it into the sagittal plane. Figure 8 shot put, I love this, is just a rhythm drill to kind of learn. The idea is not so much that it's to get big in the hands, it's that the hand motion drives the hip motion. So what you're trying to really do is load in and out of that hip. Tends to work really, really well with athletes who tend to maybe get stuck or tend to be drifty, I would say. So in other words, the torso comes out in front too early. We'll talk later about it, but like keeping the head behind the belly button as long as possible is good. That's where the figure 8 can kind of teach some of those patterns. Step back scoop toss. Here we're just trying to get a little bit more eccentric preloading. So we step back. Doesn't have to be huge. Eventually you can make it like a hide into scoop toss where it would actually be a bigger one. But all we're trying to do is get a little bit more eccentric preloading into that trailing leg. Two hop. This is more of a forward momentum drill. We'll show this a couple times. Definitely more advanced. I'm going to have some pretty good relative strength, but what's important to notice about this one as he goes through it, notice that he gains ground on those hops. It's not just him hanging out back up in place. He starts to move forward just to get a little bit of positive momentum to make sure the shin angle is good. So we're actually getting a little bit more loading in that frontal plane as he starts to trend forward. We don't want just to stay right up and down because then the loading isn't the path that we want. Recoiled shot put, exactly the same as a rotational shot put. Just don't worry about catching it. Just let it eat. With this one, I'll tell athletes, get a little bit further away from the wall, finish over that front side, and literally just try to throw the ball through the wall as much as you can. This is a 6-pound ball. I actually like this one a lot for like a post-activation potentiation. We might throw an 8-pounder and then go right to a 4-pounder afterwards just to give athletes a little bit of contrast. Step behind shot put. Again, more athletic you can be with these, the better. One of the things you'll notice, he's not aggressive earlier. The step behind is setting him up for late arm speed. A lot of people get too fast too early, and it puts them into some bad patterns of drifting forward with the head and not being able to keep the torso back into a position where they can rotate it over the top of in a good stacked position. So again, the step behind really sets you up for an aggressive hip load. So it's behind. Good. Hot feet scoop toss. Again, another preloading drill. And again, you notice he never slips outside into that position of sway where the knee is outside the foot. It's always preloading in the direction of the wall. Also does a good job of not getting too drifty with his head. So as I play this again, notice how his head stays pretty well positioned over his torso. Torso remains stacked over his hips for as long as they can. And then eventually he braces into that front hip and works out well. Double play shot put. The idea with this one is just be a little more athletic. I usually, when I saw this video, I was like, we need to be a little bit more up tempo, but I figured it'd be a good way to describe it. I'd like to see him get moving sooner. So he actually has to catch it with some momentum in play. You'll see he picks it up here. You can do this as a scoop toss. We'll do a lot of receive and release, so it's a little bit more open loop. They have to have some adjustability in what they're doing. Catcher received a shot put. So just a chance to get into a little bit more of an athletic pattern. Like to use this a lot of our catchers, and we'll do it on both sides. We'll roll it to them sometimes. Another thing that we'll do is we'll position a ball in front of them. So we would set it right on the ground in front of him, and someone would actually be behind the athlete. And on the clap, the catcher would pop up, grab the med ball, and then shot put it. So we call it catcher pop up to shot put. But the idea is just you have to respond to some kind of external stimulus. We're always trying to figure out a way to make it a little bit more coach directed, a little bit more unpredictable, so that we take some of these, conscious competence and make them subconscious eventually. Receive and release scoop toss, one of my favorites. Good drill for you to throw it a little bit harder than he's throwing it right now, but you want to force them to get their hips moving while their hands are still coming back. So you're really teaching hip shoulder separation. They should receive it as the lower half is starting to drift towards the wall. You'll often see athletes who start to dive forward with the head on this one if they don't time it up well. So he does a really good job of keeping the head back and not just drifting forward into it. Ryan was a catcher, so you can see why I did much better on the catching stuff than some of the upright stuff. You can do it as a shot put as well. To be honest, this one I use less. This one just terrifies me. I'm always worried that we're going to get a guy who bangs up a thumb. So I'll use it in the off season. I would never use this one as an in-season one, just because you never know if you're going to get one unpredictable catch. Athlete kind of takes his eye off it just a little bit, and you get thumbed, and it leaves you in a tough spot. So moving forward to overhead / anti-extension, we'll work in some single leg balance drills, anti-extension, overhead catches. We can make this unpredictable, right? We can throw it side to side. We can change the weight of the balls. We can occasionally drop one down at his feet that he has to go down and get. The point is that he's getting single leg balance with med ball's assistance. I love a kneeling overhead catch to stomp. I actually really like this a lot as an early progression for athletes who are coming back from lat strains, just because you have to eccentrically resist, basically the force of the ball pushing you back in this position. So it's a braced anterior core. Don't let the ball take your arms behind your head. I think it's a really, really good exercise. And obviously you're getting some eccentric preloading as well, just like you would get if you're doing a depth jump and trying to get some springiness through those triple extensors in your lower half. Important thing is that the coach actually throws the ball hard enough for them to actually have to resist it overhead instead of just catching it and keeping their core right where it is. So you'll notice this is a 6-pound ball. I've gone as heavy as 10 on this one to challenge you guys a little bit differently. Overhead stomps, your classic variation. You'll notice he's not trying to like stop it when it comes right off the ground. And we'll talk about why in a second, but each rep is almost individual. But we have to appreciate when we do this stuff, right? He comes overhead. He's stretched rectus abdominis and external obliques. He's stretched lat, long headed triceps, pre-tension a lot of these muscles that we're going to use a lot, in a bilateral throwing pattern, even if we're not pre-tensioning him in that crazy layback position. Recoil rollover stomp to the floor. A little bit of a thoracic rotation, just a little bit more rhythmic. This is a 10-pound ball, so we'll go a little heavier on some of this stuff. You'll notice he does get a little bit of knee valgus on the stomp. It doesn't concern me too much in light of the position it's in and the fact that he's just a little bit more anteverted, so it's a natural posture for him. But it's something you probably want to watch out for if you're training a bunch of 14-year-old females where that is a little bit more of a concern. But I love this one because it gives me a good element of thoracic rotation, a little bit more of that fascial implication that we talked about earlier. And then we want to get split stance. So like a double clutch overhead med ball stomp, learning how to brace into that front leg. So the initial pre-stretch gets us a little bit more rhythmic, store some elastic energy, and then go to town. You'll notice that Proteus in the back, that's something that we're using more and more to train some of this stuff. So as you can see on the handle, there'll be a rotational stuff. You can do low to high chops. So just something that works similar to med balls, but allows you to load a little bit higher on the force velocity curve and also get a little bit better like quantifiable feedback on it. Side-to-side overhead stomp. I use this because it was the single most impressive performance I've ever seen from a 13-year-old athlete. This kid just busted it out, and I had to video his next set just because it was so smooth. Good athlete, younger brother of a couple other kids. I love the hip shift, the weight transfer. This might be my favorite overhead stomp variation. You think about the stretch that he has to get through QL, lat, that entire lateral line, in order to stomp on the opposite side. It's really something that's got a really good bang for its buck. One leg overhead stomp, again, just train a little bit of balance. This is a good option for kind of teaching athletes how to get into that front hip a little bit more. There's no weight shift happening because the weight is entirely on the front leg the entire time. And once they get comfortable with it, you'll often see like a little bit more of a kickback on the back leg and maybe a little bit more thoracic flexion on the upper back. Split stance overhead throw to the wall. I like this. You notice what happens with the left kneecap. See how it shoots back? That's him actively pulling into the front hip to create a good downhill plane as he does his med ball stuff. So again, same pre-stretch across the anterior core, lat. Split stance recoiled rollover stomp. I like this one because it kind of combines the split stance overhead stomp and the recoiled rollover stomp. Teaches athletes how to get aggressive in the front hip. I'd say if there was one exercise we use the most at our facility in the off season, this is probably it. And we'll load it anywhere from 4 to 8 pounds. We generally won't go heavier than that, just because I feel like when the weight is too heavy, guys get stuck in their back leg, and we don't necessarily want that. The other thing you'll notice with this, I'm going to play it one more time just so you can kind of be cognizant of, is notice the neck. You'll see a lot of athletes that get very, very necky when they do their med ball stuff. And I never like to see like really, really aggressive, like veins popping out and huge forward head posture and all that stuff. I actually want to see a little bit more relaxation, neutral positioning, higher up like that. Split stance, stand up stomp, another really good one for catchers. Definitely a harder exercise than Andrew lets on here, but you're pulling through that front heel to stand up. So instead of just bracing into that front hip, you've actually got to pull yourself up into the brace. And you can do this recoil, but this one's hard enough, generally speaking, just like it is. Figure 8 rollover stomps. So notice that front foot's a little bit more open. So just a rhythm drill. Teach you how to stay into that back hip just a little bit longer and then shift it right into that front hip brace. So watch that front kneecap, see how it pulls back as he braces into that front hip. We'll call it front hip pullback. We'll talk about riding the bike into the curb. There's some level of stiffness that has to take place there to get you where you need to be. Crow hop to overhead med ball throw. You'll notice he shows this on his good side, left leg forward. It's a little different than a crow hop in the outfield. He also used a lighter med ball. I usually use a 4-pounder for this one. But the idea is just a little bit of more athleticism, forward momentum. Doing it on the right side is substantially harder. You usually got to do like a little bit of like a double hop. You're only going to see left side on this one, but definitely one of those things that you can make much more athletic if you want to. I usually encourage guys to get up before they get down. So we see some guys with some good hops that do a good job with this. Recoil blower stomp to shot put. Again, this is when we start to kind of blend multiples, right? So I'll use this as maybe a last month before spring training. This is a 6. I'll often use this with an 8 where we do the recoil rover stomp. It sets us right up from a rhythmic standpoint into that hip load. And we go right into the next one. So that might be 3x3 per side. And I'll just tell you, like, think about how this changes when you're dealing with a higher level athlete. This is Steve Cishek. Steve's got over 9 years in the big leagues. And you just look at how that front hip bracing works to let that one eat. You'll see another one here when it clicks on in slow motion. But it's just, for me, this is kind of what separates the men from the boys when it comes to rotational med ball athletes. You see some of these guys who have pretty insane rotational power, throw the med ball hard, whatever it may be. They tend to really get after it in this regard. This is his non-dominant side, so he's a right-handed pitcher. So you'll see thoracic rotation, full hip extension, the stomp, and watch how it sets up the next one. Weight shift into that front hip. You'll notice the scapular movement around the rib cage. Just a really good catch-all exercise that challenges in a lot of different ways. So let's talk a little bit about some of the cues that we like to use with these. First thing I would say is we've talked about riding the bike into the curb. You can use this on rotational or overhead. I probably use it more on the rotational side of things. One of the things that's very challenging when it comes to throwing any kind of rotational patterns, if you really think about it, if you go to any park nearby, you're going to find pitching coaches, hitting coaches, all making a living teaching people how to do that. Conversely, you never really hear about people being vertical jump coaches, right? It's kind of assumed because it's a purely sagittal plane motion, and you're going to pick it up pretty easily. In rotational sports, pitching, hitting, you've got to load and unload in the transverse, the frontal, and the sagittal plane. And one of the things that we often see is athletes have a hard time getting rotational, or they have a hard time stopping rotation. And if you really think about what happens in our world of baseball, if you're a right-handed hitter, you swing and you rotate away from first base. You need to orient yourself to sprint towards first base. If you're a first baseman, there's a ground ball, you're probably going to have to pivot and get rotational. If you're a center fielder who goes back on a ball, you're going to have to do a hip turn and go in one of those directions. You get caught in a rundown, you got to change direction. If you're a pitcher, when you finish your rotation, you've got to field your position. If you're a catcher, you might go to receive a ball and then you've got to get up and run to first base. So everything starts rotational or winds up rotational. So it's very important that you understand how to block it. And this concept of front hip pullback or riding the bike in the curve is what takes that triplanar motion and shifts it into something that's just a little bit more sagittal plane, straight ahead, so you can be efficient in what you're trying to do. A good example is stealing second base. You got to be rotational, then linear to be efficient with it. Throw the ball through the wall, classic external focus cue. I've heard athletes who have heard it, who have said that it's a game changer when they started thinking about throwing the ball through the catcher instead of to the catcher. It's obviously a good external focus cue. You'd be surprised at how many athletes just kind of like go through the motions with their med ball, not realizing that it's like sprinting. You don't run fast, you're not going to run fast. I'll give you $20 if you break the ball. I do this all the time. It's particularly good when you have a ball that's kind of like leaking after it's been around for a long time, where you can incent them a little bit and they think they actually have a chance. But I have no problem doing that. If it's going to get an athlete to take that next level of exertion, by all means, sell out for it. Think late hand/arm speed or slow, fast. You'll see this a lot, in various sports. But think about golf. If you have an aggressive backswing, it probably doesn't help your downswing, right? Because you're probably positioning yourself incorrectly relative to what you need to do. So pitching in a lot of ways is the same thing. Is if you try to chase really early speed as you kind of come out of that back hip, a lot of times it changes your arm action. It puts you in a bad spot. So what will invariably happen is the hips will open too fast. You won't be able to preserve your hip shoulder separation. So everything just kind of dumps together instead of actually riding that back hip into the front hip. So we speak a lot with our athletes about your back hip is much more about direction than it is distance. So don't think you need to jump with the back leg. Think about it just doing what it needs to do to set you up to be aggressive into your front hip to power that late hand arm speed or just whatever fast movement you want. We also talk about the hips deliver the hand. A lot of athletes get very armsy. They get very swingy. So if you start to teach them a little bit more about the hips, that can be a game changer. And we'll talk about a couple strategies here. But I love the head behind the belly button one. This is something, honestly, that works really well from a video coaching standpoint. Just show them where their head is, how long it stays there. A lot of guys will drift forward relative to where their torso is. So we want to try to keep that torso stacked over the pelvis, for a considerable amount of time. When we do see an athlete at the other end of the spectrum, we'll see athletes that get stuck in that back hip. They're often the athletes who have been cued, squish the bug or something like that. With those athletes, you have two options. One, you can actually give them a band to work in. It's kind of like a reactive neuromuscular technique where you pull back and they have to move forward to actually feel the tension of the band as they go into it. Also you have an athlete who you might use a band to pull them into it. That's the principles behind the core velocity belt. And then last, you could also just switch to more up-tempo drills, things like shuffles, step behinds. Those are things that will get athletes moving down the mound a little bit more and kind of working into that front hip instead of getting stuck in the back hip. Conversely, if you get an athlete whose torso is kind of drifting, one of the things that you can do is, you can just hold a dowel out in front of them, in front of their lead shoulder. So if they start to drift into it, they'll touch the dowel too soon. So it's a constraints-based option. You can put your hand right there. The idea is you want them to stay in that back hip and start their rotation before they start to dive forward with the torso. The other option is to use more stationary options. So if you have someone who's drifting a lot, maybe you use a figure 8 shot put, maybe you use a recoiled shot put, use a rotational shot put, something that forces them to stay back because that front foot doesn't necessarily get off the ground. This is my daughter, Lydia, when she was probably 2 and change. Just the concept of the hips going first. Doesn't have a whole lot of layback yet, but she will, probably because the ball is a little bit heavier. But just this idea is like, these are patterns sometimes that kids have, and we coach them out of it, right? We give them bad coaching cues like, stand still while you throw instead of teaching them to be up tempo. Maybe we teach them how to squish the bug instead of kind of getting a little bit more of a positive move. So let kids be athletic, and a lot of times they'll surprise you. This is another really good one, an example of kind of like the head diving out in front. This is our guy from earlier, so he's really good overhead and strode, a little bit more rotational. Notice how much forward lean there is early on in this. See how the head dives early. He actually does a good job of pulling back into his front hip. Now with this one, you'll see him look at me, get a coaching cue. I think I just told him, keep your head behind your belly button as long as you can. Hold on. It's after this rep here. So here's the coaching cue. Head behind the belly button as long as you can. Imagine me holding a dowel rod right here blocking his shoulder, or me standing behind him with my hand right there, where fire extinguisher in the background. Don't hit it. Instead, stay back into that hip a little bit longer and then pull aggressively into that front hip. And you realize it's just like riding that bike into the curve. That front hip pullback is what allows him to effectively work into that front hip. So pretty substantial improvement just by learning to stay keep the head behind the belly button just a little bit longer. Go the good one for you. So let's talk about some coaching cues for the overhead athlete. The first thing that I'll see very commonly is we'll see an overhead stomp where a right-handed individual will run away from their right arm. So you guys are seeing this in reverse just because I'm on Zoom, but we'll often see some stiffness through that lat. So they'll actually side bend away through the stiffness to get that feeling of full shoulder flexion. So watch for a head that is asymmetrical during it, and then actually show that to them, because it could just be a patterning thing. It could also be that they have a legitimate amount of stiffness on the inferior aspect of their shoulder joint that doesn't allow them to get over. So I'll video that one for easy feedback. Early deceleration is another one. I'll show you guys a video in a second here, but we'll often see people that do overhead stomps. They try to immediately stomp the med ball as it comes back up. So what happens is when you're trying to catch the med ball as it comes right off the floor, because you don't want to come back up and hit you, what can often happen is you're slowing down instead of just uncorking it. So in a situation like that, you give them conscious feedback about it. They may need to release the ball a little bit earlier. The other option is you can elevate the athlete. So we actually have a VersaPulley platform here that you would use for belt squats. But when we have an athlete that has this problem, we'll actually put them up on a box, 8 or 10 inches off the ground, something steady. You could use, aerobic steps or something like that. And we'll actually have them stomp or off a bench, just so that they realize this is what it's like to not have to ever decelerate this stuff, just because the med ball is not going to come back up and hit them. There is a little element of fear there that we need to be cognizant of. The other thing with overhead stuff, be careful about going too heavy or too light. Generally speaking, with like the figure 8 rollover stomps, the split stance recoil over stomps, when the weight gets very, very heavy, there tends to be a lot more side bending, as opposed to working over a stable torso, where you're actually getting some good thoracic spine mobility, good shoulder flexion, what we're trying to create. On the other end of the spectrum, being too light, that's a pretty good recipe for a bloody nose. If you're doing overhead stomps with a 4-pounder, it's probably not going to end well. The one thing I will say is that overhead stomps tend to be like the most harmless thing there is in terms of like low coaching needed and all that stuff. Like you can give this to someone on their first day of your boot camp at your facility, and a middle-aged woman who's never lifted weights can do an overhead stomp pretty easily. So just be cognizant of the weight selection. Everything should play out well. And then last, work into the hip. Don't just laterally flex the spine. Sometimes we get those rollover stomps where people have to go from like a closed to an open setup. They wind up kind of side bending as opposed to actively pulling into that hip. So we want to make sure that we're getting our motion in the right places. This is that early deceleration we talked about. Watch how he stops. He's really not getting aggressive at the bottom position. So what I would do for him, I would make him aware of it, see it if it improved. Might actually say, release the ball a little bit earlier. If not, I'm elevating him up, 8 to 12 inches and just saying, throw this as hard as you possibly can. There's no way that this med ball can come back up and hit you. I think what actually happened here is Andrew picked a light med ball while he was demonstrating some of the other ones. And rather than go and grab the 12-pounder, he stuck with the 6. And that's why things didn't work the way they should have. But you realize that he's never actually like getting to an aggressive finish position because he's so concerned about the actual deceleration as it comes off the ground. with that said, let's talk about a few limitations to rotational power / capacity. Cervical rotation is actually a big one that gets overlooked. I think the crew at On Base U does a good job of identifying this. But if you're a hitter that's trying to keep an eye on the pitcher while creating hip shoulder separation, so your torso is going one way while your neck has to go this way. If you have limited cervical rotation, it can absolutely limit your ability to create that. So what will often happen if your neck is stiff, everything just starts to go together instead of actually creating that. So we want to make sure that our neck moves well. The other thing about taking care of the neck is it generally has some really good downstream effects, right? You treat scalenes, you treat subclavius, pec minor, some of these things that are further up, you'll often get a little bit more shoulder internal rotation. Maybe you get some better thoracic spine mobility. Your scapula upwardly rotates or posterior tilts a little bit better. So a lot of other things clean up when you take care of the neck. Hip flexion, you don't need a ton, but you need enough just to be able to get back into that hip hinge pattern. So make sure that's something you can adequately sequence and get into. Certainly hip rotation on both sides of the ER and IR is a big one. You think about what happens when that front foot gets down. You've got to take on a ton of hip internal rotation to work over it. Thoracic spine flexion and extension. I think we give thoracic spine extension a lot of love because we focus too much on just training general population folks, and we don't realize that we have a lot of athletes in rotational and overhead sports that have very flat upper backs, and they actually may need to train a lot more flexion, more reaching, more rounding, more rotating to get to the position they need. And if you look at what our hitters need to do to hit an outside pitch, or what our pitchers need to do to get to ball release, they really require the ability to really round through that upper back. And I bet 60 to 70% of our pro guys are very flat thoracic spines, just because it's an adaptation to imposed demand. So they benefit from getting some good flexion, some positional breathing, some serratus stuff, some landmines and cable presses where they're actually reaching at that finished position. Likewise, we want to train obviously rotation, both with flexion and rotation and extension and rotation. So whether that's a reach in front or a reach behind, you need to have all of it in order to get to the positions that really matter. And then improper sequencing, that's something that's absolutely part of the equation. It's why you see so much popularity in biomechanics labs and stuff like that right now, is that if your hips go too soon, if you're chasing early arm speed, you're aggressive on the early side of rotation. Generally speaking, it doesn't set you up well for good direction or for good hip shoulder separation to be successful. Additionally, infrasternal angle can be a good predictive model. Generally speaking, your wider infrasternal angle individuals, they're probably going to get worse when you give them a lot of bilateral loading. Chances are that's already what they're good at and what they've done a lot of. But if you have a really wide infrasternal angle athlete and you have him go in and squat the house and bench press and deadlift, his rotation's probably not going to be nearly as good. So if you're going to do that stuff and you want to be successful with your medicine ball training, you're probably going to have to put in a lot of extra mobility stuff. You'll be doing your kettlebell arm bars, your thoracic spine mobility, your positional breathing, all that different stuff that can help to open things up so you actually make the most of it. The way I look at it with our rotational athletes, particularly those with wide ISAs, is that every bilateral lift I do with them is an ask, right? It's something that's going to tone up lat, QL, pec, some of those big dogs that sometimes need to tone down. So I need to offset it with something else. Maybe that's good med ball work, good mobility work, different stuff in our strength training work to kind of reverse that tendency. But those are always asks, and at the end of the day, I always come back to a 5-ounce baseball doesn't weigh very much. Our athletes need to be strong, but they only need to be strong enough. Obviously, our hitters probably need to be a little bit stronger, but keep in mind what the implement is that you're trying to actually consider when we're looking at rotational power, and also consider sport, right? Like in baseball, I don't have to worry about guys getting into collisions or anything like that. Whereas, if you train hockey players and you want to do a lot of med ball stuff, like you might be giving a little bit on the quality of the movement because you've got to load those guys up so that they have a little bit of muscle mass to protect them and not wind up with AC joint issues. What are some of our filler strategies? We'll hit ankle, hip, thoracic spine mobility, scapular control. We'll do end range lifts offs. We'll do single leg balance. We'll do coordination drills. We'll do technique practice. So maybe A1 is a rotational med ball scoop toss. A2 is some kind of, one arm serratus wall slide with a valve slide. B1 is a side to side overhead med ball stomp paired with a prone external rotation end range lift off at the shoulder for some active control of external rotation. But the point is just that you can do whatever you need to do, and it's a way to make your session a little bit more productive. We'll mix in Turkish get up practice or something along those lines just to make people have a little bit more, productive time in the gym. And then last, but certainly not least, the right equipment really matters. The problems with med balls, sometimes they're too bouncy. This was an issue. I actually did a presentation a long time ago. We had a hands-on component, and the med balls that showed up were really, really bouncy. And we had a bunch of people in one of those big conference rooms inside of a nice hotel that were almost killing each other with the med balls as they flew across the room. They also can't be fragile. One of the things that we found was, you saw the picture at the start of this slideshow, we were breaking stuff within an hour out of the box. When you're throwing something against the med ball wall, that can be a little challenging. One of the things that we learned was there was a little bit of like a worldwide rubber shortage years ago. So a lot of companies that made rubber med balls were using more filler products in their med balls. So they were breaking really, really quickly. With that said, we use the Extreme Soft Toss for Perform Better. It's been the best one that I've seen. They do make a large one and a small one. We generally use a large one a little bit more. If you have a 4, 6, 8, 10, and 12, that'll take care of 98% of your needs. We might have a 20 or 25 if we're going to go out and do some clean tosses or something like that out on the turf. But for the most part, that covers everything. The other thing to make sure of is that you looked at the predictability of the rebound. Some brands, no matter how much you break it in, you're still going to get very erratic bounces. And it's the biggest pain in the butt ever, because a lot of times these are rhythmic drills. You want athletes to go, 3x6, where the eccentric preloading from the previous rep is making more elasticity, or you're doing like a side-to-side overhead stomp and you want an athlete to be able to get in a high quality of work. It's really hard to do 4 sets of 4 on each side if you got to pick up the med ball after every single rep. So that's why I like these. One bit of suggestion is when you get them out of the box and just sit on them for a day. Like, kind of not like sit on them as in don't use them, like actually sit on them, like put them in the warm-up area, have athletes roll out with them, something like that. Sometimes breaking them in is a little bit better just because it takes down or makes the predictability of the bounce a little bit better. They seem to be a little bit more durable if you do a gradual, lower velocity, higher load, breaking in period. Just because, like I said, we've gone through so many of these over the years that we've learned how to kind of attack it a little bit differently. So that said, these are the websites. One of the things I was going to tell you is at ericcressy.com, we actually have a free presentation, actually 2 free presentations about individualizing the management of overhead throwing athletes. And then another one that talks about hip shoulder separation, rotational athletes, a little bit of the same stuff that's in here, but in greater detail on some of the exercise that we would use to train thoracic mobility, hip mobility, some of that, and also speaks a little bit more to the the mechanical side of things of pitching. So if you do want those are both free at ericcressy.com. You can check them out. Facility is cressysportsperformance.com. I am Instagram, Twitter, Facebook at Eric Cressy. And with that said, I am more than thrilled to take any questions that you have. I don't know, Pat, do you want to MC?
I'm trying to scroll through, see if people are raising their hands. But if someone has a question right now, you can just jump in and we'll get rolling.
I have a question.
Sure.
Good to see you, Eric. Thanks for this.
No problem.
This was awesome, man.
Thanks, Eric.
One question that I have, I don't see you using the hook'ems. Are you not using the hook'em scoop toss anymore?
Yeah, we've kind of phased those out over the years. That's a great question. We did have those. For those of you who don't know, a hook'em scoop toss, if I'm a right-handed rotation guy, I would take my left foot behind my right knee. So the idea was that it would allow you to stay in that right hip a little bit longer. You know what I think we saw a little bit with those is we saw a lot of athletes. So this is probably going down a little bit of a different rabbit hole. I think a lot about not just positions, but pressures. And I've actually had this discussion with one of our pro baseball guys like an hour ago. But the concept of being rooted into the ground, and what I think I saw a lot with hook'ems is it got guys very drifty. And the goal was to just get going and be in single leg stance. But I'm not sure it actually did a better job of getting them into that hip to actually like hold the ground. You know what I mean? And
yeah,
whether you're a hitter or a pitcher, holding the ground as a hitter, it gives you adjustability. As a pitcher, it allows you to delay that hip shoulder separation a little bit longer. And I always felt like when we did a hook'ems, we got a lot more, basically torso tilting on the back side. So for me, I stepped away from it because I felt like the figure eight, some of those drills were just even just like a regular stride drill were a little bit better for us learning how to like find that hip and hold it. But I wouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Like there might be still people that I would use that for, especially like really veteran athletes who've been around for a long time who understand what it's trying to accomplish. But we definitely don't use it on the throwing side any things anymore. But periodically you'll see it in a program on lifting.
The reason I asked, so last year I happened to get to go to my team practices too.
Mhm.
So I work with the guys in the gym,
Okay.
and then I get to see them at a practice. And what I noticed last year, and I don't know if this was just a coincidence, but we were doing the hook'ems, and at the same time, the coaches were starting to throw breaking balls, curves, and stuff like that. And the coaches were actually saying that they were really surprised at how the kids were able to stay back when they didn't know the curve was coming, where they kind of, time for a fastball type of a thing. And they're kind of getting on that front foot, but then they're
Yeah.
being able to hold the body back and then hit the breaking ball away.
Yeah.
I was like, it was, kind of something that happened by accident. And I
Yeah.
wasn't sure if that was something you guys had noticed and trained it
Yeah.
for that.
Yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, obviously it's like a little bit subjective, but
Yeah.
it also, it can be a great drill if it's meticulously coached and if the torso positioning is good. I think, we pick exercise based on the ideal outcome, and then we also are, to steal a Mike Boyle line, there's what you know and what you can implement. If it's the kind of thing where you got 10 guys in front of you and maybe 8 of them look great and 2 are then maybe you try to fix something that's a little bit different. But that's great, man. Hey, if it's working, don't fix it, right?
Okay. No, I just didn't know if you guys, 'cause I know you guys are so in depth with it. I didn't know if you had kind of noticed that earlier, and if that was kind of the point of the hook'em was to help with the breaking ball, or if it was
Yeah.
just, maybe it was just a coincidence,
Yeah.
like it was, you know.
I think it's no, we definitely did do it in that regard. And interesting, I don't think we ever had a true staff meeting where like we're done with hook'ems. It's just something that I think our exercise library kind of expanded. We picked up on some new stuff, and we thought maybe there was like some other stuff that we liked a little bit better.
Awesome. Thank you.
No problem. Thank you. Saw another hand go up there.
Yeah, Ash Higgs, you're
All
up.
right.
All right, thanks for taking my question, guys. So I've been loving being a member of the Athlete Acceleration so far, but one of the things that I've noticed is that the material is much more team sport oriented. I'm a combat sport athlete and trainer.
Yep.
So I just have a question for Eric this morning. Like, how much would your med ball training approach vary between like an overhead throwing athlete and a combat sport athlete?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the first thing I'll tell you is what they would love is actually like the medleys that you can utilize from a metabolic conditioning standpoint, just because it's different than what they've normally experienced. And not only that, it's very rarely in a lot of the condition we encounter, like do you get a lot of upper extremity fatigue? Certainly we want to use our hips to deliver our hands, but you add some chest passes, some of those things, you'll actually get a little bit of the upper extremity stuff that you would also experience if you're dealing with a boxer or MMA guy or something like that. And I just don't think you get that. Like, I mean, I can go out and crush myself on the Versa climber or the rowing machine, or obviously like the Airdyne bike. And it's never my upper extremity that's the limiting factor. But in those industries or those sports, I should say, that theoretically could be a concern. So I like it as a medley for sure. In terms of how things would change, I probably wouldn't sell out for a crazy amount of volume. Maybe you do 2 sets overhead, 2 sets rotational, prior to a couple of your training sessions each week, or you tack it on at the end of a warm up. This is just a little bit of a way to get them charged up. I'm sure a lot of those guys have plenty of other outlets to get their anger out when they fight people for practice. But I wouldn't go overboard with it like you would if you were training a tennis player or a baseball player or hockey player or lacrosse player or something like that.
Great, thank you.
You got it. Thank you.
Let's go on. Jason Schwartz next.
Hey, I was wondering, this is more in regards to what you were saying earlier on in the presentation with the transfer from like single leg hops, like lateral hops, as opposed to Olympic lifting and vertical jumping with transfer to power. Is there a point where there's maybe for like rotational athletes where you can overtrain or overuse like rotational power movements?
Yeah, I would say, first off, there's going to be times of the year where you just need to give them a break from it, right? And so just so you know, 2020 is like for a million different reasons, is totally atypical. But I was just talking with one of our major league relievers. He threw 19 innings this year. Like, this is a guy who's used to making 70 plus appearances every year, and he threw 19 innings in 60 games plus playoffs. So it's just, he's not beaten up like he normally would, and guys are going to train. So we're getting him going a lot sooner in that regard. But historically, minor league season ends September 5th or whatever it is. Those guys are not doing a whole lot of aggressive med ball stuff until like the second week in October. We're going to give them a little bit of a break, just because no matter how perfectly trained it, like that aggressive rotation is going to beat up on a hip. It's some pretty aggressive elbow extension for doing a shot put. So we do have kind of like we have to be cognizant of those things. But beyond that, I think the things we have to appreciate is where are you using your bullets, right? So in season, as a right-handed individual, are you taking 500 swings a day between cage, game, all that stuff, and then not doing anything on the opposite side? So maybe you just come in and you do 3 sets of 8 on the left side as a way to try to just get a little bit more balance. I think that's something that could be really, really helpful. Second thing I would tell you is that maybe it's the kind of thing where you're just looking at an opportunity to give them different points on that force velocity curve. So as an example, if you have an athlete who has trained with you for a long time, they're crazy strong, and then you spend a bunch of time bringing them the other end of the spectrum, training a lot of 4 and 6 pound stuff, then maybe you're actually going to go and you're going to attack some Proteus or some Versapol or some heavier med ball stuff, kind of make more like a strength speed type dynamic. So maybe that's just a different way that you can kind of play through all this stuff.
Right. Are you ever doing anti-rotation as a way to balance out that rotation stuff, or is it mostly?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. You saw it right. A lot of those exercises that were on the front end of the presentation, like the split stance and the half kneeling anti-rotation stuff, we may do that on the opposite side. The other thing, I'm going to put it out there, but I don't have really good definitive data on it yet. Okay. So take this all with a grain of salt. This is a hot take right here. This is something you find on like Boston Sports Talk Radio. But Greg Rose has talked about some of the best long drivers in the world being individuals who participated in opposite side dominant rotational sports. So the guys who swing golf clubs really, really far right-handed may have taken like left-handed slap shots playing hockey growing up, something like that. And it makes sense, right? There's a certain amount of asymmetry. Early on in a lot of the power testing we are doing with our Proteus, we are seeing similar trends, that they actually are more powerful in certain ways on their non-dominant side. Early on when we did it, we actually were testing guys right after they had thrown a bullpen. We rolled it out with our college crowd, and we weren't sure if it was fatigue that was causing it. So we've started to do it with our pro guys on our early off-season assessments on the Proteus, and early signs actually point to it holding even more true in our pro athletes. It was it went from like a 3% difference to a 5% difference. With that said, it seems like from elasticity measures, they tend to be better on their dominant side. So it seems like elasticity is what makes them have some semblance of rotational prowess on their dominant side, and then on the other side, maybe there's just enough strength, true power at a slower speed to kind of offset it. So it's very preliminary. This is the stuff I stare off into blackness, like thinking about at 3 a.m. But we're doing some really cool stuff, and actually some of it's kind of in the works for potentially some journal publications, depending on the data sets and all that. So don't claim statistical significance on that. Just say that we're seeing some cool stuff. And what's neat is we have a really good sample size of everything from 14-year-olds to guys who have 3,000 innings in the big leagues. So we're going to keep looking closely at it.
Well, appreciate the answer and the inside scoop.
No problem. Sorry for the rambling topic on my soapbox.
No, I love it.
Let's go to Tom Hoffman.
Thanks, and thanks for the presentation, Eric. You spoke
Tom.
early on about using med balls and variability, just as a variety for general athletes. I'm wondering how you might incorporate it using it for general athletic clients, but who only see you once or twice a week.
Yeah.
How you might kind of, they can't really continue to build and grow on it, but you want to make sure that the workouts are interesting and inventive for them.
So actually, I'll give you the best example I can give you. I have a guy. I have very few personal training clients, but one of the ones I enjoy the most, the guy who's 59 years old, awesome dude, super successful, kind of retired to down here. So we train twice a week. Really good athlete in his younger age. He's actually worked in, in pretty high levels of professional sports. And so we train twice a week. We do a warm up, and then one day a week it's like an overhead stomp. The other day it's a rotational drill, and we'll just do it before we go to our lifting. So we'll kind of use it as like an extension to the warm up. I'll pair it up with some kind of mobility drill. He's a guy who tends to get pretty necky. And a lot of stuff he does, he spends probably more time at a computer than he wants to. So we'll do a cervical rotation drill in conjunction with a rotational scoop toss, and that's what makes it in. And then those are the guys that you give like a wild card to in terms of conditioning. So it's 10-minute warm up, 5 minutes med ball, 35 minutes lifting, and you got 10 minutes left over at the end where maybe you're going to hit them hard for 5 to 8 minutes with conditioning and give them a little bit of mobility, takeaway on the way out. Maybe it's something where every 3 weeks you throw a med ball circuit at them. Like you might do intervals on the bike, you might do the Versa Climber, you might do slide board. To me, it's a different way to train power, probably a safer way to train power than having them go out and sprint and worrying about an Achilles tendon or something like that. And also probably lower risk than, potentially like teaching a kettlebell swing for higher reps or something like that.
Appreciate it. And would you do, 4 sets of 4 for a warm up, or would you?
Yeah, you could. It depends on the drill. I mean, like you got to remember, some drills take longer than others. So like a step behind rotational scoop toss, it just takes a while for every rep to play out because you got to go back, reset, and get them going. So I think one of the things that I would definitely do if you're looking through some of that stuff is to to just make a point of manipulating volume depending on the exercise.
Thank you very much. Perfect.
You got it.
All right, let's go to Brandon Bullitt.
Hey, can you hear me now?
Yeah, I got you.
Okay. For some reason, my laptop wasn't working. Anyways, Eric, a couple questions. With working with a team setting this year, were there any changes as far as programming strategies? Anything like that different from your private sector?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing is, in a team environment, you're in season, right? So in off-season dynamic, you get to do everything you want to do. You have this embarrassment of riches with time. You have no time changes. We didn't have any COVID to worry about, like what time you could get to the stadium and stuff like that. So there were certainly changes in that regard. Maybe the other thing too is that this is first year, so athletes need to know you and like you before they can trust you. So I built up a lot of that rapport in the off season with our guys over the years, and to some degree, there's a velvet rope that goes around having a facility in the private sector, where people come to you for your expertise, and you have to win that. You have to use that expertise to win people over a little bit more when you actually get to the pro ranks. So no, I don't think necessarily there was a dramatic shift between what we would do off season versus in season under normal circumstances. It's just a matter of doing it with a lot of new athletes and lining it up to their individual needs. So it's more assessments, and what's good though is that now we have like an actual off season to work with them and try to get some more of the chronic adaptations that we're trying to get through. But I wouldn't say that there were like sweeping changes. I mean, the physiology of the athletes is the same. It's just a matter of the market, the time of year, and whether they're right in front of you at a big chunk of the year.
All right. Second question. As far as like onboarding some of your new clients or old clients, whether it's their first session or it's returning from the season, have you guys implemented any like testing? And I know you said in the video that you guys do the Haydn for distance.
Yep.
And then the Proteus. Is there anything else other than that?
We'll do a vertical jump as well in terms of performance testing. Everything else tends to be more movement based.
Okay.
Whether it's general or specific, objective, subjective. Like I said, looking at more an infrasternal angle, I think is something that we've looked at a little bit more. We've always been big on test retest, where we're always lucky to have manual therapists and physical therapists on staff, where if we need to treat a subclavius and see how it impacts shoulder internal rotation, we can do that on the fly. So I think you never throw the baby out with the bathwater. We're probably 90% the same. But I'd say a lot of what we've done in terms of our actual performance testing has changed, because we got away from that for years and we brought it back.
Cool. All right. Yeah, that's it for me. Thanks, man.
Thanks, man. Good to see you.
You too.
All right, Dean Dumas.
Yeah, close enough. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah. Hey guys. Thanks for doing this, Pat, for facilitating, Eric, for all the great information as always.
Thank you.
Couple questions here. One, access to the library of video, and I just want to confirm that is going to be the case with this.
Yeah, Pat's probably want to ask. I mean, you guys will have access certainly to the entire video of the presentation, so
Okay.
you should have every video on there.
All right, cool.
I'm not the tech guy though, so I'm only here for my good looks and charisma.
There you go. Hey, two is back to kind of what Tom was touching on. When I deal with some youth clients,
Mhm.
Tennis and lacrosse, as well as baseball, but more and more lacrosse, and the variability of changing the types of movements, the exercises that you would if you see them at max twice a week.
Yep.
How long do you stick with one before they actually learn the movement and kind of perfect it before you move on for that variability factors is question one. And then really couple top movements for those two sports, both rotationally and anti-rotationally speaking.
Yeah. So the first thing I would say is it's kind of a two-pronged answer to your initial question. The first one I would say is remember, we're always still encouraging athletes to play multiple sports, right? That's going to give you a whole lot of the variability that you actually need. So,
Right.
Unfortunately, like nowadays, like, kids just don't play as much. It has to be organized. So you miss out on, I mean, you go out and you play soccer, it's 2,200 changes of direction if you're a midfielder over the course of the game. Like that's a lot of stimuli that you're just not going to get. So I think, always encouraging guys to go play pickup hoops, ultimate frisbee, street hockey, whatever it is. Certainly do that. I think that's really, really big. And I see with my daughters, even just opening the back door and be like, go outside and figure it out, jump on the trampoline, play in the hammock, whatever you want to do. So we do that a lot. With that said, we program all of our stuff in 4-week blocks. And I find it's the best, kind of, blend of having just enough consistency to make progress, but at the same time, giving them variability so that it doesn't get stale. So that's typically how we will attack it. One of the things that we do a little bit more, probably more so at our Massachusetts facility than in our Florida facility, is we'll throw like different dynamics. We'll call it the group dynamics. There's maybe like an individualized warm up, 8 exercise. Here's what you go through. And we do this with like our college program a lot, where it's like, all right, after that, it's like, respond to something. So it's very like coach directed, partner mirror, side shuffle. Like we have a Nerf hoop in our warm up area. Like we played knockout with the guys before. Like we'll do different things in that regard. So trying to put in a little bit of variety at the end of the warm up before the training session, I think can be really good. Even done that with our pro guys. Like, I mean, I was watching the Indians during the playoffs, and those guys were kicking the soccer ball around. They had hacky sacks. They had footballs where they were running routes. I love that stuff. I know people in pro sports get a little bit freaked out about it sometimes, but I think it's great because, sports tend to bring you, in many cases, to so much unyielding specificity that you got to find some variety. So that's kind of, I guess, my take on that. And then the last point, kind of the best exercise for lacrosse or best exercise, I generally don't do that. For me, I don't think carryover is that specific necessarily. I mean, the best exercise for lacrosse is to play lacrosse. So I much more look at the athlete in front of me, and I think it helps because then you don't get resigned to certain exercises. Because if I tell you the best exercise, is a box squat, and you've got an athlete with a wide infrasternal angle and a bony overgrowth in their hip, you're going to beat them up really bad. So for me, there's no best exercise. There's just the best choice for the athlete that's in front of me. So hopefully that makes sense.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, Justin Hewitt.
Yeah, thank you. Quick question. So I've got a youth basketball team and a volleyball team. So my question is going to be, you had spoken to basically a 16-year-old group is going to get much more out of it than a 12-year-old group. I have both.
Yeah.
Would it be smart to incorporate ingraining some of these motor patterns with the med ball throws early on as 12-year-olds? So when we get to 16, we can ramp that velocity up?
Yep, absolutely. You know why? All that matters at age 12 is that they fall in love with exercise.
Right.
That they think training is cool, that they get to do what their big brother or sister does, and that the technique is good. Like my daughters come to the gym and they pull each other on the sleds, they hang from the chin-up bars, they like to swing from the TRX stand. Like all that matters is that they fall in love with it. And you know what's fun? trying to break stuff. And so
Mhm.
throw med balls, do whatever you can, have contests to see who can throw them farther. Like I think that's huge. So you're going to set the stage. I know, Pat worked with Mike Boyle on the youth sports conditioning product. And I've said it, I mean, I've told this story 100 times. Mike made a really good point in that presentation. He talked about his daughter, Michaela, who, I mean, she won a national championship in hockey as a freshman. But Michaela, he said, averaged 2 lifts per week from age 11 on. And obviously, you're not going to yell at your kid at age 11 if they don't get their lifts in. But, there's something to be said is, 7 years of 104 sessions a year, right? So if you get, 700 something extra training sessions in compared to somebody else, yeah, maybe it's 4 days a week when you're in high school. Maybe it's only like once a week when you're in season. Maybe you go on vacation for a week and it's 0. But if it evens out over the course of time, I feel like by the time you're a senior, you're just playing with house money. So I really love it when kids get involved in the weight room, at 10, 11, 12, not because a crazy parent did it, but because the kid thinks it's cool and it's just like playing a pickup sport or something like that. But that said, we don't usually work with clients under age 12, but you look at guys like Dave Gleason and Jeremy Frisch, what they're doing with young kids, I think is so awesome. So keep fighting the good fight, man.
Cool. And second question with that too. So basketball is probably going to have a bigger transfer over from like triple extension for hip flexion to extension. So would you focus more with those types of throws with basketball and continue with both with volleyball, since we do have an overhead aspect in volleyball?
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. Understand the demands of the sport. You're not going to be rotational in basketball that much. They might do well with actually posted some on my Instagram about it, just like a creative conditioning option, like med ball, like side shuffles where you actually have to receive it, almost like some of the fake chops, which are kind of a whole other class of med ball stuff that they were starting to use more. And Lee has certainly talked a lot about that as well. So you could integrate some of those, but yeah, volleyball, you need the best of both worlds, and that's a really good point.
Probably a good place to put that would be, as you said, after the warm up, just to get some exposure, so it's not too much time.
Exactly. I think you always think about, when are they the most fresh? Unless you're doing conditioning with it in a more advanced athlete who has, good awareness. I think, you're always hitting it right after the warm up before your strength training work.
That's great. Thank you.
You got it, man.
All right, Dominic.
Hi, I'd like to know, would you do the same number of reps, less reps, more reps on the opposite side?
Yeah, historically we'll do the same number of reps on each side, but we might add sets on a non-dominant side if we felt like that was appropriate.
Okay. So
But generally speaking, yeah, it might be 4 aside within the set, but tack on an extra set on the left side, on the last time.
Okay. Okay, thank you. And I'd like to know also for the weight of the ball.
Yep.
You use a lot of lighter balls, but would you use the 20, 25 pounds in some sports or some circumstances?
Very rarely for me. We'll use them if we're doing like a clean toss out on the field or something like that. But I would say I'll do a little bit of heavy overhead stomping, but not often. I'd say most of our rotational work is 4 to 8, and most of our overhead work is 4 to 12. And so like the more split stance or rotational it tends to be, the lighter it tends to be. If it's just like a bilateral heavy overhead stomp, it's probably going to be a 10 or 12.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, Coach Pat.
Hey, Coach, how you doing? Thanks for doing this for us today. I got a question. I have a major league guy who, for the past 3 or 4 seasons now, he goes into the spring training and suffers an oblique strain. So would you say that I need to focus less on some of the med ball stuff because he's getting a lot of that rotation during his hitting? Or do I need to focus more on anti-rotation in the weight room?
Ooh, it's a tricky one. So the first thing is usually we'll see the oblique strains on the front side, right? It'll be the attachment around the 12th rib.
Right.
So if you think about what's actually happening, right? So if we're looking at, is he right-handed?
Yeah.
Okay, so right-handed. So if we're looking at it from the top down, pitcher or position player?
Position player, infield.
Okay, so infielder. So what's happening is his torso is rotating counterclockwise. His pelvis is rotating counterclockwise while his torso is going the other way, and it's creating a stretch in the front. The first thing I would tell you, if there's poor anterior core control, it's not just going to be a stretch in the transverse plane. It's also going to be a stretch, in the sagittal plane, right? Because he's going to scissor up. So every oblique strain that I've ever seen has been someone who was lacking in some capacity at anterior core strength. So make sure that looks good. The second thing is you have to also look at, like, is there a pronounced asymmetry? What we'll see, if you're familiar with the Posture Restoration Institute, you may see an adducted right hip, someone who has tons of left thoracic rotation, but not a lot of right thoracic rotation. So I would look at that. I would look also at if he's a very wide infrasternal angle, which isn't uncommon for someone who's very limited in their anterior core control, is that he may be ingraining a lot of those patterns with a lot of heavy bilateral lifting, and the play might be to take a step away from that, and all of a sudden his rotation is going to improve. But above all else, what you said is he's had it multiple times. And the number one risk factor for an injury is a previous injury in the same area. So the thing I would look at is rehabilitated correctly. What's interesting is if you strain your hammy, they'll do soft tissue work on it. They'll try to teach those fibers to realign correctly and deform as you want them to. Obliques are tricky. It's a hard area to soft tissue. Nobody wants you to poke around in their belly and in the lateral aspect. We've had actually really good success doing that. So we have good manual therapists in our area. So I'd say make sure that he actually has gotten good treatment on the actual injury. But when it comes to medicine ball stuff, there's certainly a place for it, as part of an overall program. But I would always fall back on what's happening from a movement standpoint before we start training something that's maybe a little bit more performance oriented.
Right. Thank you, Coach.
You got it. Oh, other one I would tell you, look at active versus passive thoracic rotation. That's one that gets missed a lot. So if he's 40 degrees actively and then 90 degrees passively, that's usually where those injuries occur.
Yeah.
Yep.
Thanks.
Cool. No problem.
Let's go to Joshua Martin.
Yeah, how's it? I know you mentioned your clean tosses. Are you concerned with various needs, like on the loading of med balls? On the load phase, or what's your preference on that? Like starting with the ball overhead, loading it, or making it look like it's clean?
Yeah, I think it should look like a clean. So the question was, when you do your clean tosses, are you worried about valgus loading? In other words, the knees coming together, and
varus. Like the ball is too big and they're putting it in between their legs and pushing it out.
Yeah, I think to me it's all about just manipulating foot position so that it's underneath their hips, and if they're too wide, they're going to be valgus. If they're too narrow or the ball is too big, they're going to be varus. I'm more inclined to say no. I don't lose a whole lot of sleep over it, but I can coach it pretty easily. Even if it just means you got to be a little bit slower and deliberate at first, and then they pick it up longer term. But no, I've never seen an ACL rupture on a clean toss. It's not maybe a habit we want to necessarily get into.
Yeah, but would you as far as progression, would you start with the ball, stagnant at below the hip level, or start over?
You absolutely could. The other thing is to remember that the extreme soft toss med balls, think about it this way: if you're talking about an athlete who's going to have that issues, it's probably going to be a weaker athlete, right? It's not going to be your 240-pound linebacker that is throwing the 50-pound med ball. So if you're talking about a female athlete that's doing it with an 8-pounder, you can buy the smaller 8-pound version, which doesn't overwhelm her as much. So maybe you just go with a different brand.
Okay, thank you.
You got it.
All right. Anyone else with questions? Just raise your hand. It just makes it easier for us. The button, raise your hand. I can't see everyone on the video. Right? I know a couple questions that were in the chat. I think we got to most of them. Josh Gibson, if you want to jump in.
There we go. Actually, I see Josh's question. How would you organize the progressions of these exercises? Simple, complex, slow to fast. Yeah, for me, anti-rotation stuff on the front end, single leg, taps to the wall or overhead taps, anti-rotation, receive and relief, stuff like that in the first month. Half kneeling anti-rotation, scoop toss, split stance anti-rotation, scoop toss, all those. Month 2, rotational scoop toss, rotational shot put, figure 8, stuff where the center of mass is kind of well positioned inside the base of support. And then month 3 for me is, looking to, more step behind, shuffles, receive and release, more up tempo stuff. And then, we might go to month 4, like a complex training where it's heavy to light, We may even we've done complex training. We'll do a set of pull-ups, then go to an overhead stomp right afterwards. So the possibilities are really endless in that regard. Justin Hewitt asked, incorporating med ball work into the high performance handbook. Thanks for your business. Usually I tell folks 3 days a week, or 2 to 3 days a week, 1 rotational, 1 overhead, and just do it after the warm up and before training, and then pick 2 of your favorite mobility exercises to plug in as fillers to kind of make the time go a little bit.
All right, any other questions? Last call.
Guys are ecoing easy on me.
I have one for you, Pat. How long are we gonna? This is gonna be up recorded. Are we gonna be able to access this afterwards to kind of watch it a few times? Will it be up for us to watch for a little while?
Just one time, then it disappears. No, I mean, you'll have access to it forever. So
Oh, really?
Yeah. So, I mean, as long as Athlete Acceleration is around. How about that?
That's it. Love it. Love it. Thank you.
We'll send you the presentation. So after this gets recorded, we'll have to get it uploaded and all that. So